All right, welcome back once again, everybody. It's the Dr. Treefort and Don podcast. I am Don Seifrit. It is Friday, May 31st. It is the end of May. I'm here with Dr. Kari Peter. Say hi, Kari.
Hi.
I'm here with Dr. Craig Krawczyk. Say hi, Craig. Say hi,
Hello.
Greg. Uh,
Hello.
and Dr. Shan Kumar. Say hi, Sean.
Hello, everyone.
Cool. So, Sean, if you would like to go first and give us kind of a brief update as where we are tree-wise, and then we'll lead into the pressing matters of entomology and pathology.
Sure. Thanks, Don. We are past thinning season really for most of the state, and at Adams County, I think yesterday we checked the Fuji that we had thinned, and so it's around anywhere from 25-30 millimeters and above, and honeycrisps are probably larger than that. And what we saw from our own thinning for Fuji was it did require some hand thinning. So this is the time to go into your blocks and check your blocks to see if they require thinning or they require hand thinning, or they were well thinned or even over thinned. And the other thing to note is that there is a physiological drop of fruits as well at this time, June drop. And traditionally, I've heard from growers and pomologists there in Adams County that most of it happens at the end of May and probably the first week of June. So probably a second week of June is probably a time in Adams County and surrounding areas where you can kind of clearly see all the fallen fruit and the fruit that is remaining on the tree, and then kind of have your estimate on whether you have to do hand thinning to reduce the crop load or whatnot. And then, as we saw during our spring meetings, a lot of the state is somewhat in a similar stage to Adams County or a few days behind. And that is it, except in the northernmost fringes. But otherwise, we are pretty much, maybe a few days behind here in Rock Springs. Our fruit as well are growing pretty fast. And that is where we are with the overall status of the tree. Things to be thinking about for your new plantings. If you've planted new plantings, usually if they're high density plantings, it's time to do about give about 1 or 2 doses of nitrogen about 4 weeks apart. And usually for the initial planting, the first and second years, just to give that extra strength for the trees to grow, I try to provide nitrogen that's more available in the nitrate form, calcium nitrate, usually 2 to 4 ounces, like just a handful around the trunk. Just make sure it doesn't touch the trunk, or you can just, if you have a fertilizer spreader, that will work as well. So 4 weeks apart, 2 to 4 ounces of calcium nitrate each. Maybe an application now and an application again in a month's time would be good for those initially newly planted trees this year. And I had a few questions about herbicides, especially on glyphosate-resistant maristale and also other weeds like Canada thistle, that are not responding to gramoxone. And so we are seeing widespread resistance to glyphosate for different species, but also we are seeing resistance to gramoxone in many weed species as well. So if you do have that issue, I always like to combine burn down herbicide and a systemic herbicide when I try to apply my herbicides. More recently, glufosinate ammonium is becoming more popular as a burn down option to combine with your systemic herbicide. So we have a few options for glufosinate ammonium as a burn down herbicide, which is we have Interline, Rely, and most of these we apply at 56 fluid ounces per acre. And usually I combine that with a systemic herbicide. And systemic, we have many choices. Usually we apply between 4 to 5 fluid ounces per acre, or ounces per acre, sorry. And that's AIM. And so we have a lot of options for the systemic ones. And so usually a combination of these two will control any very persistent weeds, especially at this stage of the season when the weeds have already grown past 3-4 inches where you can just control them with something, some burn down herbicide or gramoxone. So it's important to consider a combination in order to control your weeds. And that's where we are at weeds. With the last thing I just wanted to quickly touch down, which I can talk about in detail next week as well, is about nutrition management for Honeycrisp. We've had quite a few growers talk about in our meetings talk about calcium applications. And time and time again, we've seen that calcium, foliar calcium sprays do help, but only to a certain extent to control bitter pit. And it's more to do with the ratio of calcium, potassium to calcium, and nitrogen to calcium. If you have over fertilized your trees, or there's an abundance of nitrogen, and if you're using potassium in any of your sprays, and that doesn't necessarily have to be nutrition sprays, it can be sprays potassium for other aspects that has potassium as an element in that spray for other things like insects, diseases, and for general growth. That I know that a few growers use potassium-based products. And so it's important to regulate that potassium, especially if you have bitter pit in your honeycrisp, because higher rates of potassium prevent the uptake of calcium and in the fruit. And so we do want to stop potassium altogether unless there's a deficiency or anything at this point, especially if you have a history of bitter pit. And so managing your nitrogen and potassium will probably give you better results in terms of managing bitter pit rather than calcium. Having said that, calcium sprays are still very important. You want to go ahead and do by once in 2 weeks spray of calcium chloride. About 5 to 6 sprays starting from now will be good for varieties like Honeycrisp. Even though it is less effective, it can still give you some protection from bitter pit by increasing the calcium levels. But again, the more important part is, again, I want to emphasize to focus on the nitrogen and potassium ratios, and to do leaf and fruit peel sap test right about June. Peel sap is the most easiest way, I guess, to see the ratios between nitrogen and potassium to calcium. And then you can make your decisions as to the nutrition management program for Honeycrisp to control bitter pit. But I just wanted to put that in, and let me know if you have any questions, but that is my update.
Cool. Thanks, Sean. I was just gonna ask if you were gonna bring up doing like leaf analysis, foliar analysis, because normally June we talk about that specifically. So yeah, but did you have something else you wanted to say before?
Yes, I did want to have some questions. I wanted to just address things that I've been seeing in my orchard. So I felt like we had a good fire blight management protection plan in place, but I'm seeing shoot blight in different regions in my orchard, different parts of my orchard, specifically in my Gala NC140 block. I'm seeing a lot of infections in this particular rootstock IFO rootstocks, which are the New Zealand rootstocks that are part of the Gala NC140 trial. And it is interesting to note that many of these rootstocks had coal damage in 2022 because of that sudden drop in temperature in Christmas. And we've removed some of those trees, whereas some of those trees are still alive. And I was wondering if maybe that has a connection to the shoot blight that we're seeing specifically in that area. And the other area we're seeing fire blight is our variety block. And I believe that's just because there's some history, and also that there's a huge variation in that. And I'm seeing some infections there as well. That as far as fire blight. The other thing, I'm seeing a dogwood borer. I'm catching a lot of dogwood borer in my orchard. And just a question for Greg about dogwood borer and what we're seeing, and how much of dogwood borer are we attracting through the pheromone from the woods nearby, and how much damage, etc., etc. And to Kari about the fire blight. But those are my questions for Kari and Greg. But yeah, thanks.
So to address your questions about the fire blight, I'll go more into detail about fire blight management and such a little bit later. But to address your question specifically, I'm wondering with that particular rootstock, if it was damaged, if usually now this is a horticultural question now. So if it's damaged, would that cause the tree to sort of want to like be pushing a little earlier, like as far as, because I've seen where trees are weak or they aren't as strong, they tend to behave a little differently, especially like when they break dormancy, when the flower buds are coming out. So I'm wondering if the reason why those trees got fire blight is that those blossoms were vulnerable sooner rather than the rest of the galas in the block. And so that or they were just those blossoms were just vulnerable at the wrong time. And maybe they weren't protected by streptomycin. That's what I'm wondering as far as seeing the shoot blight, as far as the influence, because it most likely was blossom blight that started it. And then now what's most obvious, it's usually difficult to see blossom blight unless you are truly scouting for it, but you do see the shoot blight. But if you see the shoot blight, you could probably kind of trace it down and possibly see the affected blossom clusters. But was my first thought, was that if the tree was damaged, it probably its cues to behave the way it's supposed to behave were off as a result, because it's trying to survive. And so I'm thinking that's why you're probably seeing fire blight. And as far as before we started the podcast, we talked about that variety block. And if you're seeing fire blight in those older galas, I wouldn't be surprised if that there's some old fire blight cankers in there that are fueling the fire, so to speak. And there's probably a history of it. And so especially for how old it is. And I don't know, as far as I know Rock Springs has gotten fire blight in the past. So I know there is a history. So it doesn't surprise me. But it's something to be thinking about in the future when you're managing. I think moving forward, since you're the one in charge of those locations up there. So it's just something to be mindful of. And then especially thinking about strategies during bloom that will limit shoot blight later on, like incorporating apogee into the spray mix. But those are my thoughts as far as about your situation.
Thanks, Kari.
Greg, I'll pounce it over to you with regards to answering his dog borer question.
Yeah, I thought that maybe Dan will let me talk. But anyway, dogwood borer is a complicated insect, and at the same time, it's a very simple insect. High numbers are a relative term. And, if you are in the hundreds per week per trap, those are high numbers. If you are in the 20s, those are not high numbers. Saying this, 20 are high numbers when you're catching them around newly planted trees in the young orchards, and hundreds are something that is expected in the old orchards. So that's something to remember, that it's very difficult to actually assess what is the threshold level or something like this. I mean, I'm not in big favor of actually using any thresholds for any capture, because those can be affected by so many different factors. And then telling somebody that they should spray because they catch 10, but what they shouldn't because they caught 9. Well, it's kind of, it's not really the way I'm looking at this. So dogwood borer is using apple as one of the hosts. So if the orchard is surrounded by other older blocks, if orchard is surrounded by the woodlands, forest, the numbers in traps will be probably much higher than in the orchard that is surrounded by the cornfield, from each side. And again, if you catching dogwood borer in young orchard, the need for any treatment is much higher than catching dogwood borer in the older orchards. And it's very simple. I mean, dogwood borer will feed under the bark in the outer layer of the trunk, but they will not really kill the old tree. Saying this outer area on the young trees is much, much smaller. And then the trees can be girdled and then basically be broken with the wind or, storm or something like this. We still have lordsban. I mean, as much as we talk about it during the winter, one thing about the lordsban is that some of the formulations that are on the market, I don't remember exactly which one, but some of them are legal to use during the season as long as the user guarantee that there is no contact with foliage or fruit. If the orchard is just planted and there is no intent of any harvest from those trees, that basically kind of, make it easier for the application, and maybe spraying lordsban on the newly planted orchards, even right now, makes sense, because this way lordsban has a very long residual activity, and it will provide the control from dogwood border, and the same will be on peaches from the peach tree border, basically for the whole season. That was the advantage of the using lordsban earlier on, because it provides this long residual activity. But again, the issue is that if there is any chance that there will be any crop on those trees that people plan to harvest, then this rule about not touching fruit or foliage is very important. So something to remember. I don't know, should I go on with my insects, or Dan is...
Please
okay.
do.
Okay, so going to some other stuff. We are still in the spring season for the insects, and spring mean, we were dealing with oriental fruit moth, plum curculio. Now we're dealing with the first generation of codling moth, tufted apple bud moth, oblique banded leaf roller, and kind of getting ready for what else might be coming, like aphids, woolly apple aphids, Japanese beetle, mites, stuff like this. Talking about stuff that is already past, I mean, one insect is completely past, which is a European apple sawfly. I mean, whatever you have in the orchard will not change until the end of the season. There is only one generation of this insect. The flight is over. Whichever larvae were not killed before entering fruit, they won't be any new eggs. There won't be any new larvae. However, I have seen fruit even this year already with the European apple sawfly feeding inside the fruit. They make a straight hole going directly into the center of the fruit with a lot of frass and a very characteristic smell. You will smell it, it's probably the most smelly frass that you can get from the insects. But whatever happened, there won't be anything more. Another insect that is almost like this is plum curculio. We generally done with the flight of the first generation plum, on the only generation of plum curculio that we are aware of. However, on apples, you can see the damage, and you can actually, you will see it probably for the rest of the season, when on the stone fruit, the larva actually might be going inside the fruit. You can find right now plum curculio inside peaches, inside apricots, inside cherries, nectarines, any stone fruit, and they will survive, and they will actually develop. And after they develop, they will drop to the ground, and that's where they will spend time, at least until August, when the adults will emerge again. They will do some feeding, which sometimes can be confused with the tufted apple bud moth, but they will do some feeding and then fly to their overwintering sites. I stress that stone fruit, but I will go back to apples for a moment. Sean mentioned that, June drop is coming or is already happening and so on. If there is any plum curculio egg that was deposited on the fruit that actually will drop to the ground, and this might be in response to the job drop, which is natural physiological event, or the thinning. The plum curculio can develop also in apples that are not growing, and then the story will be exactly the same as it is in stone fruit. So this is something to remember. The good part is that there is really no more there's no more need to control plum curculio. A similar situation, however more complicated, is with the oriental fruit moth, which just terminated the flight of the first generation. There might be some stranglers still, flying, still coming to the traps, but this is the tail end of the third generation oriental fruit moth flight. I'm assuming everybody was trying to control it, but this is a good time to actually assess the damage and the potential for the second and consecutive third and fourth generation by going and looking at the growing shoots, especially on peaches or nectarines. I mean, you can, by looking for the flagging, you will see how effective your program was. If you see a lot of flagging, it means, well, something was missed or the timing was wrong, and then you have to be ready for the managing oriental fruit moth for the rest of the season. If you don't see any flagging on your stone fruit, on peaches, the chance is that population is not there or at such a low level that oriental fruit moth might be just controlled by the way when you try to control some other pests. The second generation, looking at the development of the larvae that we're finding in some of our experimental orchards, I expect that the second generation oriental fruit moth will start flying next week. This will be the beginning of the flight, and then we'll have 3 more generations before we're done with this pest. The one that is in the middle of the flight and the control is needed right now is codling moth. This past week, we're recording this on Friday, so this week was the time for the second codling moth application in most orchards here in the southern end of the state. Next week might be the time for orchards located farther north. Theoretically, if we look at the models, and even if we go to newer, the second application, which is supposed to happen, about 550 degree days, base 50 after the biofix, which is happening now, should be the only application is needed. Reality is, and this is from the last 5+ years, we see that codling moth flight of the third generation is much more extended. So even if the model tells you that you should control codling moth with 2 precisely time application, one at 250 degree days, the second one at 550, which is right now. If you still see codling moth in the traps in your orchard, remember that if males can find the trap, it means they can also find the female. And if you don't protect your fruit later on, well, those females will lay eggs and those eggs will hatch. Again, we're trying to control larvae. The most effective products we have, all the diamides or delegate, which is spinosyn with different IRAC group, or granulosis virus, all of them targeting only the larvae. They won't do anything against the eggs. They won't do anything against adults. And if those products residue is not on the fruit, when those eggs hatch, well, they will go inside the fruit. And this happens very quickly. It's really very fast. It's less than 1 day. And when the larva is inside the fruit, there is nothing you can do to kill the larva. Saying this, again, at the beginning of July will be time to assess how good your codling moth control was, because at the time, whatever was not controlled now, you will see them in the fruit, and those injuries will be visible. But the good part is all those fruit will drop to the ground. So the one that you see at harvest, the one that actually affecting the quality of your crop, those are the second or potentially third generation codling moth larvae that you will have in the orchard. So again, now you control them because of the model, because of your trap data. Then to decide how intensive your management need to be later on, you can use the visual observation, which usually is late June, early July, when you will see the injuries, and then you can decide about what to do until end of the season. The product will be the same. The only thing is that if you decide to go with diamides right now, then please do not use diamides for the second generation. Then your only option will be either virus or the delegate. Or if you go with delegate or virus now, then please stay with diamide or this other part, either virus probably, for the second generation. Don't use the products with the same mode of action for 2 consecutive generations of this pest. We have cases of diamide resistance in Pennsylvania. It's not widespread, but we don't want it to become widespread. So rotation of the products. Again, diamides are products like Altacor, Exirel, Verdeprim, Voliam, Besich, Mimecto. All of them belong to the group of diamides. Delegate is a completely different product with different mode of action. That's a spinosyn. And then the third group are the viruses. And the viruses, which is the codling moth granulosis virus. You have the products with like Madex, Sidex, or Virosoft. If you decide to go with the virus, please remember that virus products lose their efficacy after 7 days. So if you want to rely on the virus, and the virus is approved for organic production, it's a very effective product, you really have to maintain the 7-day interval between application if virus is your main product. Other thing to look right now for are the woolly apple aphids. And again, if you don't have it, you don't have to do anything. If you start seeing this is the time to use Movento. And Movento should provide a good control. Other aphids, Spirea aphids, will become visible. They will mostly be concentrating on the still growing shoots. With the amount of rain we got, there's probably a lot of fresh growth on the trees. That's where Spirea aphids will be. Any neonicotinoids will control Spirea aphid. You can wait until lady beetles will come and take care of them. Usually Spirea look bad, but they don't do the damage that really affect the quality of the fruit. You can wait until Japanese beetle will start showing up, and this will be not long from now. And then you can control aphids and Japanese beetle with the same products at the same time. So those kind of things, we will keep talking about it as we start seeing more. I didn't see any Japanese beetle yet. I have seen woolly apple aphid, but not really to the point that any place require the control. So we're kind of in this transition between the end of the spring in very, very intensive to the summer normal control management of insects. One thing that also, this is a good time to look at right now, would be European red mites. Orchards that have a good biological control, European red mite should never show up. Orchards that already use dormant oil or maybe they went with Apollo or Savi at petal fall, also should not see mites. However, if there was a lot of pyrethroid being used last year for one reason or another, this might be a time to look for the mites, and this is a good time to use zeal. Zeal works at this time the best until we will have to switch to summer acaricides, which, again, we will talk about it later on, in June and July. So that's really about my updates. I try to cover a lot, but again, we're kind of on the tail end of one group of pests and beginning of the other ones. So we will keep you updated as we go. So Dan, any questions, or we can move to Kari now?
No, that was really great. Thanks, Greg. That was comprehensive. Dr. Peter, last but certainly not least.
Okay, so Sean already touched about this, about fire blight, and I have been getting emails and phone calls from people about seeing fire blight and what happened and what can they do now. So to start off, this was a great fire blight infection year, unfortunately. And as far as monitoring the conditions, I got the alerts out the best I could. But I know that rat tail bloom, I think a lot of people were caught by this because there was a major, a 3-day infection event from April 15th through April 17th. That was a manageable one. So if you got a streptomycin spray just before that or right at the start of it, you should have covered it. However, at the end of April, this is in Biglerville, mind you, and probably the southern half of the state. So in the southern part of the state, and this would cover probably the northern part of Maryland as well, and probably southern New Jersey if you took a line, because I think how the conditions were. From April 29th through May 4th, that was one long infection event there. So if any rat tail bloom was around, this is probably where your fire blight came from, because this is the time you would be seeing it. And so right now we're in fire blight conditions. So the fire blight is going to be manifesting. So what to do right now? What should you do? So first of all, let's talk about as far as prioritizing cutting out affected orchard blocks with fire blight. You want to be triage. First of all, if you have a lot, you need to triage. So this is how you want to triage your decision making when it comes to managing fire blight right now. First of all, focus on young orchards that are 3 to 8 years old that have just a few shoot blight strikes. So that is basically dead shoots that have the shepherd's crook. These blocks should be your highest priority. Then after that, you want to be focusing on those same age orchards, about 3 to 8 years old, with several strikes, which has more than a few strikes throughout. So you want to be paying attention because these are still young blocks that you want to be salvaging, especially you don't want to be having so much fire blight that it's progressing down to the rootstock. And then ultimately you may see death in subsequent years, which I can tell you that does happen. And it can even happen on bud 9 because I'm witnessing it right in my orchard block right now. I have a big old canker at the base of the tree, and it's killed the tree. The next one is older orchards with a few strikes. So we're talking older semi-dwarf orchards, anywhere from 10 to 20-year-old dwarf orchards, that have a few strikes. So you want to be focusing on the youngest orchards first and then transitioning to the older orchards. The walk-away group, and there is a walk-away group. These are orchards that have so many strikes that if you cut them out, you're actually going to make the problem worse. Because by cutting them out, you're telling the tree, I need to grow more shoots. And by growing more shoots, that bacteria is going to be zipping through the tree and then causing more fire blight. So the more you cut, the worse you'll see the fire blight. So the treatment is backfiring, or the as far as the fix or the management is going to backfire on you. So walk away from these orchards. So these can be young orchards, I should say young dwarf orchards. These can be big old blocks as far as the big processing trees, or older semi-dwarf trees that have a lot. But the more strikes you see, the more you have to spend time cutting out. It's not worth it. So it's very important to avoid excessive cutting of basically shoots from these trees, because it's just going to trigger the tree to make more shoots, which is just going to make the fire blight presence worse. And ultimately, it just might end up killing the tree. And this can be also said for young trees, because again, I've done it. I've tested this. I've done that. I've tested this hypothesis for you already. The more you cut, especially in young trees, the more chances are that that tree is not going to survive. So you may have to make some tough decisions, especially for newly planted trees or young trees, where you're finding yourself constantly cutting out from these trees. Okay, so once you've triaged, what do you do? Well, number one, you don't want to be cutting out infections during wet weather. The bacteria moves around via rain and wetness. So foggy weather, wet weather, you want to be cutting out during dry weather. You want to cut out the active infections early. So the sooner you see necrosis, the sooner you see sort of tissue death, the more you can stay ahead of this. And, this is especially important for, especially for young blocks and high density blocks. And because this will end up limiting the spread of the bacteria. Again, you want to prune. The pruning is most effective when the incidence is low. I've been telling people all month that they need to be scouting. So if you're seeing stuff that's completely off the rails, well, I hate to say it, but I told you so. I mean, I've been telling people since the very start of the month, at the very first spring meeting, that they need to be scouting, because it gets a lot more challenging later on. Focus on salvaging the structure of young high density plantings. So that's going to be very important, especially when the incidence is high. Another thing to be mindful of is that bacteria can invade 3 feet beyond that site of infection. So even though you are cutting beyond sort of maybe 6 to 12 inches, depending on the size of the branch or the size of the tree of where you see that infection, knowing that the bacteria is already zooming past that. So consequently, tool sterilization is a moot point. Now, if you see oozing, now, this could be a different conversation. And depending on how hot it is, you may be seeing oozing. Oozing kind of comes and goes, I've seen. So, if this is something that is of concern or you do see it, you may want to use some sort of sterilization as far as cleaning your tools in between cuts, if that is necessary, if you aren't able to make a clean cut, especially if the canopy is dense. What can you use? You can use alcohol. You can use bleach, 10% bleach. You can use something like hydrogen peroxide, pine sol. I mean, anything that is a disinfectant will help clean your tools. So, but I will say this is that, like, we've done this study and we really didn't see a difference in tool sterilization. So I personally don't do it because I find it too much of a hassle, but some people, they're determined to do it. So you do what's best for you and your operation and what you feel most comfortable with. As far as practicing the ugly stub method, when you're cutting out the fire blight, leave a stub. Don't cut it flush with the trunk of the tree. The goal is we want to limit that getting into the trunk of the tree, into the central leader. Because what happens with that ugly stub is that bacteria is going to be sort of held up right there at that stub, and you can come in during the winter as far as cutting it out. As far as removal of these cuttings, ideally you want to get them out of the orchard, stick them in the burn pile, set them on fire, get rid of it. Depending on how much you have, my go-to is really what Michigan has recommended, is just cutting it off and putting it in the drive rows where it's going to be mowed. It'll be dried up, it'll dry up and then get mowed over. And that's what I do all the time. And I haven't seen any issues with that. If you've got big limbs, I definitely take those limbs out. But for anything small that can be chopped up by a mower, just throw it in basically the row middle, let it dry, and then make sure you go through with a mower later on. As far as another thing to consider, especially with young plantings, is this Actigard paint method. And this is on the Actigard label. And paint is used as a verb. You aren't physically using latex paint and painting it on the tree. You're making a very concentrated solution of Actigard. And what that entails is that you're going to make a 1% solution of some kind of adjuvant that's a penetrant. So Pentrabark is what's suggested on the label, you can use Li 700, some organosilicone. So, and then you're going to mix a 1% of solution with that and then add in 1 ounce. And so you can mix this up into a spray bottle or to like a 1 liter little solo sprayer. And then when you make the cut, you want to be spraying basically about 1 meter of the trunk right below that cut. This is how it describes on the label. So it's like you cut and spray the trunk. And what that's doing, it's activating the plant's defenses in the wood. And it will limit canker development, and it should limit spread of the bacteria into the trunk of the tree. You can also spray the wounded cut too. I do too. You from that 1 ounce in that 1% solution, and about you can get about 500 cuts. But the directions of it, the specific directions, if you didn't catch everything I said, this is on the Actigard label, and it's listed as the Actigard paint method. Again, you aren't using silicone, you aren't using latex paint or any kind of paint. Paint is being used as a verb here as far as exactly what you're doing. It should be called something else, but it is what it is. Another thing that I would highly recommend is what I've been telling people is to be applying Apogee at a very high rate to shut the trees down. This will harden off the shoots and limit further spread among healthy shoots because the trees are still growing. Stop them growing. If you stop them growing, that should slow down basically the trees from basically spreading even more. But you're going to have to do this a few times. So when I see it in my orchard, I go out, regardless of the size of the orchard, I put 12 ounces. I put the max rate, 12 ounces to the acre, whether it's Apogee or Kudos, to shut my trees down. And I'll do that application more than once. Remember, it takes 10 to 14 days for this to kick in. So it's just something to keep in mind. You may be gun shy from applying 12 ounces on your dwarf trees in a high density orchard. Apply 6 ounces in, or 6 to 8 ounces, but you want to shut that growth down. That's the only way you're going to be slowing down this the progression of this disease and the spread of it. Now, in years past, we've talked about Cueva sprays using 2 quarts to the acre of Cueva. This won't eliminate shoot blight. The train has already left the station if you have seen shoot blight. The best you can do is slow it down a bit, but you aren't going to get rid of it. And you're going to have to be spraying Cueva a lot. There are other coppers out there, but they will most likely have issues with fruit finish. Cueva does not, or Cueva has basically it's not, what's the right phrase? It's not as harmful to the fruit finish as other coppers, and that's due to the fact it's it's the formulation. It's a very low copper count, metallic copper content. And so it's not a lot of Cueva in that 2 quarts. So it'll slow it down, but it's not going to get rid of it. Now, I've heard of other things out there. I'm not going to mention them because I haven't tested them. And people swear by them, but I will say until I test it, I'm not going to endorse it. So, I'm personally, people have sworn by it. It worked last year. Well, last year really wasn't a bad fire blight year. So this is the year that I'll be curious if they can get some of these products to work. So we'll show, I'm not going to discuss any of these things that I'm hearing as far as anecdotal stuff, just because I don't want to put ideas into people's head and then get physically, literally, figuratively burned in the process. So we'll discuss that next year when hopefully I have a chance to evaluate some of these products. So that is the story for fire blight. The next thing I want to cover, I'm going to have to keep my emotions in check. It's about apple scab. I am hearing a tremendous amount, more than one to me is tremendous, of issues of apple scab that people are seeing. And I will tell you that don't blame it on the fungicide. It is not the fungicide's fault, because I'm already been contacted by chemical companies asking me to see when the infections periods were, because so-and-so sprayed X fungicide and now they're blaming it. Well, I'm telling you right now, we're going to have to revisit 4 years ago during the 2020 spring meetings, or not, it wasn't the spring, it was the winter meetings, where I revisited this. Why do you see disease when you think you've done everything right? And chances are you have done something incorrectly. It is human induced scab. Let's put it that way. So we're going to review this again and also discuss the infection periods that have occurred. This has been an extraordinarily wet year. And even though last year was next to non-existent, well, that scab just lay dormant because it reared its ugly head this year. So I went through the scab infection periods for the Biglerville area, for Adams County, South Central. And there's a tremendous number of apple scab infection periods. And they just weren't one day. They were multiple days. And they were during the peak periods. Some of the worst ones. And this, if people are listening to this, get a pen and paper and write them down. And then go to your spray records and see where you missed. April 11th through April 13th was very good. April 15th, April 17th through April 20th. That was one long scab infection event. This was when this was when things were peaking. The end of the month, April 27th, 28th, April 30th, May 1st. And then we have this lovely long scab infection period from May 4th through, May 4th through May 15th. I remember that vividly because it was during our spring meetings. And basically, I think one of those meetings, we actually were outside in the rain. So this was an excellent scab year. So if you're seeing scab, number one, there's a reason why we had good scab infection events. So, but number two, let's ask ourselves some questions. Let's look in the mirror and ask ourselves some important questions if we're seeing scab. Number one, was my sprayer calibrated? In other words, was it reaching the top of my trees? I typically see scab appearing at the top of the trees, and this basically seeds the tree because the sprayer is not reaching to the tops of the trees. So it's very, very important to know whether or not your sprayers are reaching the tops of the trees. Another question, number two, question to ask yourself is, was I using enough water to cover my trees? 50 gallons per acre versus 100 gallons per acre, depending on the size of the trees. You know, it's really important. Was I getting a good enough coverage? Because if you aren't using enough water, you are not distributing that fungicide appropriately around the tree or effectively throughout the tree. Was it rainy from late pink through petal fall? And that answer is yes. And then my next question is, did I use alternate row middle sprays during this time? And now for newbies listening, alternate row middle sprays, what are those? That means you're only spraying half a tree. Basically, you're only spraying half the tree. It's also called a half spray. You aren't doing a complete spray. A complete spray is when you go up one side of the tree, turn around, and then come down the other side to get at the same, basically in the same spray. This is, you are basically you're just spraying half the side, going around, go to the next row, do that half side, going up the row and the next row, up half side. So you're getting half sprays. Now, the reason why this all came about, and for those listening, I should say Greg in particular, this was mainly done for insects because insects have legs and they can crawl around. So when you do a half spray of an insecticide, there's a very good chance they're going to be picking up that insecticide as they're crawling around. That is not the case for diseases. Diseases don't have legs, in case people were wondering, and they don't crawl around. So when you're doing these half sprays, that means the other half is unprotected. And when you are doing a half sprays, the rule of thumb is that you go in very quickly to get that other half side covered up. And so you want to be keeping your intervals very short. And my next question is, during this peak period, is that, okay, if you're using alternate row, if you're using complete sprays, what's your interval? Typically with complete sprays during an interval like this, it's 7 days. If you're doing half sprays, you need to cut your intervals in half too. So you want to be spraying like 3.5 days, every 3.5 days for alternate row middle sprays to make sure that that other half of the tree is not naked. So let's talk about the spray interval for a second, because as I've been talking to people, consultants, growers, they've been emphatic to me. They've said, well, I kept my interval at 7 days. I kept my interval at 5 days, even when I'm doing alternate row middle sprays. Well, folks, if you're doing a half spray, that means that other half has been naked for 10 days or 14 days. So if that other side is not being covered up quickly. So consequently, especially with the infection periods we have, there is a high probability that you got scab because there was essentially no fungicides on that other half side of the tree. And we had enough rainfall to be able to wash fungicides off this year. I mean, it's been, the amount of rain we've had so far has been a lot more than in years past. And this was a year where we had lots of rain to be able to wash stuff up. I was even watching, as far as for my own research sprays, as far as keeping things tight for myself and spraying more often, especially between petal fall first and second cover. I shorten my intervals and I do complete sprays as far as making sure my trees were covered appropriately. So I want folks who are listening who have scab, who identify with having scab right now, is to go to their spray book, and there's, as far as seeing when they sprayed, especially when they did half sprays, and actually seeing how long that other half was uncovered. Because 7 days, spraying half sprays every 7 days is not going to cut it. And if you're also relying on basically the fungicide, the spray moving through the trees because the density isn't that great, that's another problem too, because either the other side of the tree is not getting an effective amount, or it's getting a sublethal amount as far as to be able to control the disease. So this is, for people who know me, they know if you want to push my buttons, tell me that you use alternate row middle spray in the early season, especially during from late pink through petal fall, because chances are, especially this year, you are the reason you got scab if you were stretching your intervals like that for alternate row middle sprays. And so this is something that people need to go look through their spray books and see basically when the fungicide was sprayed during those times. And there's a lot there was a lot of time as far as for the scab to cause infection this year. So another question to ask yourself again is, even if you were doing complete sprays, how long were you stretching your intervals during this really wet period? And because in some of these cases, a week, it was like we had 2.5 inches of rain during that week period. So that's another thing, looking at how much rain fell during those intervals. Was it a windy day? That's another question to ask yourself when you sprayed. If it was a windy day, what are the chances that you actually got the right concentration of the fungicide on the tree? Believe it or not, another question you want to ask is, how fast was I driving? Because you should be driving at a certain speed to make sure that you get your decent coverage. If you're driving fast to get things through, well, that may be a reason why the fungicide wasn't effective. Another thing to think about is adjusting the fan speed, because I saw this happen a few years ago with a grower. It was similar conditions like this year, but they dialed down the fan speed once they got closer to the end of the row. And that's because there was a lot of action going on at the end of the road. There were bins. There was a parking lot. The market wasn't too far away. So I understand why they dialed down, but that's where their scab showed up. And then another question to finally ask yourself is the affected location in a low-lying area that's going to stay wet. And this year, that is important, but also this is a year where it just stayed wet because either it was foggy, it just never dried out for these long stretches. So we basically simulated a low-lying area as far as not really being able to dry out during these really wet periods. But that is also something to think about your own location, your own orchard, about low-lying areas that don't really dry out effectively. Well, this is a year as an example of what happens when things don't dry out effectively. So that is my rant, my dress down. I'm not quite sure, my stern talking to about why you're seeing apple scab. And I will end with just the last comments about the apple scab issue is that people always wave the fungicide resistance flag. And that it drives me crazy because you can still get effective control even with fungicide resistance if you're doing things correctly. And correctly, I mean tank mixing with a broad spectrum fungicide and complete sprays. I have an orchard that has terrible strobilurin resistance. That's FRAC 11. And this is common. This isn't anything new. When I'm do complete sprays and I don't tank mix with a broad spectrum, my disease incidence is about 50-60% on fruit in this orchard. When I tank mix with a broad spectrum like a rain-fast mancozeb, I drop it to below 10% incidence scab. And that is not keeping my intervals as tight as I should. So I was spraying maybe every 7 to 10 days. So basically, don't tell me you got fungicide resistance, because you can still get control even with fungicide resistance out there. It's all in the application of how you're doing things, and also tank mixing with a broad spectrum fungicide. With that said, I did hear about folks using Maravon during the middle of the season and having issues with Maravon or another strobilurin. And as I tried to advocate for this, I really want to see those strobulurins in the summer season, because that's when you're going to get the most bang for your buck for it. You still have that Frac 7 in Maravon, but it's that strobilurin that's the strongest for those, as far as for those rots go. So we may have to revisit this, but again, Frac 3, 7s, and 9s during this time period. Now, since we are in the summer season, especially with Honeycrisp, you can start your bitter rot regime. It was a little warmer at the start of the week. It was warm last week. It's going to be semi-quasi cool wet over the coming week, but I still would start it. And so just to quickly segue into that, you want to be looking at Aprovia, Omega, both which have a 28-day to 30-day PHI, Flynn Extra, Luna Sensation, Maravon, tank mixing with 3 pounds of Captan to the acre. Always tank mixing. So using a rotation, especially because it's calling for rain next week. The weather is always changing, but it's calling for rain next week. So this is something that you want to be considerate about, and especially going into said summer and this potential said rainy period, really be mindful of how much rain is falling, how old is your residue when the rain starts, and how basically your intervals, because your intervals are going to be just as important now, especially for bitter rot control, as they were in the early season, especially for the precious Honeycrisp, which is a lightning rod for bitter rot. So just as a gentle reminder about that. The other thing, just to quickly comment, rust. This was a great rust year, and the rust galls finally last week dried up, at least in Adams County they did. So if you're seeing rust, well, it was basically a good scab year, good rust year. Mancozeb should be taking care of that. But if you farm organically, well, you're in for a rude awakening. There aren't really any effective organic controls for rust. And then lastly, powdery mildew. So I've been hearing reports about powdery mildew. And in some cases, I think I know why I'm hearing about powdery mildew. And it's because people stopped spraying at critical times. So they started right. People kind of came out the gate and they said, got on a good powdery mildew control right away in the season, probably earlier than they needed to, like at 1/2 inch green. But they were covered at tight cluster. They were covered subsequent after, but then they stopped at bloom and petal fall. And I'm like, why'd you stop? Well, I don't want to spray sulfur during bloom and petal fall. I'm like, well, what did you spray during that time? Well, I just sprayed mancozeb and Captan. Well, mancozeb and Captan aren't going to touch powdery mildew. So if you're seeing powdery mildew, this may be due to the fact that you may have not had a good powdery mildew control during a key time. You still need to be controlling for powdery mildew till the shoots harden off. This is where apogee will also help you, because apogee will harden off the shoots, and then powdery mildew is not a problem. So this is another incentive to use powdery mildew. So as far as what to do now, as far as shutting it down, you can use sulfur to sort of shut things down. The strobulurins that you'll be using for rots will also will help slow it down as well. But this year has been so wet that really the incidence out there shouldn't be too bad that it should cause any fruit infections. So I'm not as worried, but for people who are a little bit more concerned, that's something you want to think about. As far as circling back to scab, if you see scab, everyone's always asking me, how can I burn it out? How can I burn it out? How can I burn it out? Because once you see scab, this is going to be a season-long problem, and it's going to be hard. And honestly, you want to be wishing for hot, dry weather, because when it gets up to 85 or higher, this will shut scab down. Chemical-wise, you can be using a high rate of sulfur. high rate of captan to help slow things down. It may have some efficacy, but we really don't have a fungicide labeled for that can be applied right now that's going to effectively, quote unquote, burn stuff out just because of how far out we are from the infection. So right now it's a matter of keeping things in check and keeping the fruit clean. So with that said, that was quite a bit there. So Dawn, any questions?
There was something several minutes ago, but you were on a roll.
Sorry. I will say this, folks. If you need to go back and refer to your notes, go back to 2020, the winter meetings of 2020. The reason why about apple scab and why I'm seeing diseases, because 2019, that spring was a really good scab year, and what I'm seeing now is exactly what happened, or very similarly what happened back in 2019. So you should know better. And you've sapped my sympathy for any sympathy, I should say, if you're using alternate row middle, especially during this time. As I mentioned during the 2020 meetings, is do it at your own risk and don't come complaining to me when you have scab, because especially during a rainy period, because that's what happened this year, is because the fungicides weren't, probably applied timely or appropriately.
I know.
Yes.
I know what I've got.
Okay. Question.
If I am new and I'm trying to figure out a spray program, what are the pros and cons of doing a complete spray versus doing half sprays?
Well, if you're there, okay, I will tell you this. The pro of complete spray is that the tree is getting completely covered, particularly in the fungicide, in that moment in time. I don't see any cons to complete sprays. If you talk to a commercial grower, they'll tell you, well, I can cover more acreage in basically half the time. They use it as a time saver. And they rather have half the tree covered than no tree covered. And I'm sorry, but I don't buy that argument. I don't buy that as a pro, or I guess a con of using complete sprays. So basically the reason why people are using half sprays is either they don't have enough equipment to cover the acreage that they have, or have enough people. It's usually a time factor. That's why people do half sprays. But I see I'm quoting what the benefits are. Personally, for me, from my perspective, I don't see a benefit to it for diseases. Insects, it's a different story. But diseases don't move, and you're going to have half that tree uncovered for a number of days before you can get the other half. And if, God forbid, you have a wedding event, it really only works is if it's dry conditions. But if it's really wet conditions, that other tree is going to go through an infection period. And, again, you may or may not be able to shut that infection down once it's started, depending on what chemicals you use. So that, as far as pros and cons, there's nothing but pros for complete sprays. But from the commercial grower perspective, they see it as a con because they can't cover the amount of acreage. So they're going to leave half the tree naked, essentially. So.
Yeah, I wanted you to clarify, because I think if folks are new and they see folks talking about doing half sprays, and they listen to you talk, they're like, okay, well, I'm confused as to why anyone would ever do
Yeah,
a
no,
half
that's
spray,
a very
right?
good question. And it seems to be now, I feel like this is unique to the area, to Pennsylvania, maybe southern New Jersey. I don't know about Maryland, but when I talk to people north of here, especially with the folks in New England, when I've spoken up there, they're like, we always do complete sprays. We never do half sprays. They're always puzzled by by this half spray. And so this isn't a typical habit. But that is why, for people who do use alternate row middle or half spray, it really started from, and Greg quote me, it started with insects. Being able, and as far as getting coverage on the tree, because basically you could use half the spraying because the insects are going to meet meet it at some point and then be controlled by it. But it doesn't hold true for diseases. So really, the rule of thumb is if you're a new tree fruit grower, you want to get the whole tree sprayed right away. I mean, as far as like if it's time to spray, you want the whole tree sprayed.
Cool. Thanks. Yeah, that's just, I was like, we should clarify that.
Yeah, no, thank you for mentioning that because, like I said, this has been on my mind since Tuesday, since it's come to my attention. And as you can notice, this is something that, yeah, my blood pressure is cranked right now because it's like we've been down this road, folks. We've been down this road before. So,
All right. Well, everyone, let's take deep breaths. Let's go into our weekends, unless anyone has anything else they want to add. Rest now, speak now, or forever hold your peace.
yeah.
All
Yeah.
right. Thank you guys so much. I will get this into everyone's hot little hands for the first. We were pretty verbose this past month, so it looks like we're gonna start June the same way. Thank you all for listening and say goodbye, everybody.
See you later.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.